Right. Hello, everyone. We are finally coming in for the next video in our little look at Japan going into World War One. So, for this next video, as the last two that we talked about two of the first big wars that Japan really got involved with in order to expand its empire and expand its footprint on the global stage, especially in East Asia around the area of Manchuria in Korea. That was the two main conflict areas. In 1894, they had had the Sino-Japanese War with China, and then leading into just about 10 years later, they had another war come out with Russia, in which Japan would be the first Asiatic power to defeat a European one, and Japan managed to secure Korea for itself, leading to its 1910 annexation of the kingdom into its own empire. So Korea is no longer a separate entity. It is officially a Japanese colony by that point. With those two wars won, Japan has set itself up as a major regional power in East Asia. But there would be another war on the horizon that was going to lead to an even greater expansion for Japanese expansionism, while at the same time setting up some of the basis stage for the future. And that would, of course, to those of us who know our history very well, we can probably figure out what war that is very quickly. And that would have been the First World War, which would break out in August of 1914, shortly after the Austro-Hungarian Empire would declare war on Serbia toward the end of July. And then it would just be a domino effect from there, with Russia, Germany, France, and Britain all getting involved, and it just spiraling into a global conflict. Japan, as an ally of Britain, would be drawn into that very same conflict, and it had quite a success story during World War One, in which Japan was an ally during its time around. It would not be come 20 years down the road. However, the effects of what World War One would do to the Japanese thinking would end up contributing to the rise of militarism later on, and it would greatly set Japan up for further expansionist efforts that it would start to pursue in the decades following. So this is not going to be the longest of the videos. In fact, this is probably going to be one of the shorter of the few, as we're just going over some of the basic actions and things that endured during in Japan's experience in the First World War. Now, as we said, World War One would break out in Europe in August of 1914. Japan would sense this as an opportunity to further expand its empire at the expense of the European powers, who at this moment kind of occupied with the ongoing war in Europe. They knew that, for example, one European power had a lot of colonies in the Pacific and Asia that were now highly vulnerable, those of the German Empire. The German Empire had started gaining territories and colonies around the globe starting in the 1880s with the scramble for Africa, and it had kind of gotten a lot of the smaller territories there and in the Pacific that the other major powers of the time, most notably Britain and France, didn't want for themselves. So Germany actually had the world's third largest colonial empire in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. Only the French and British colonial empires were larger. Now, Germany's multiple colonies in the Pacific and concession cities in China were now highly under threat because Japan, who is seeking expansion, sees an opportunity to hit at a country that is bogged down in Europe, while at the same time, Japan has a treaty of alliance with Great Britain since 1902, so it's kind of inclined to help its British ally, and the German colonies seem like a very easy target to pick off. Japan would immediately propose, upon the outbreak of war, it would propose to its ally of Great Britain to join the war against Germany if Britain would allow the German territories in the Pacific to be taken by Japan. Britain did ask Japan initially to help them destroy the German navy in Chinese waters, and they very reluctantly gave Japan the permission that they wanted in order to, yeah, sure, if you take these German colonies, you may keep them. Britain wasn't all for, although they were allies with Japan, they knew that Japan was an expansionist power, and they rightly feared what that could possibly mean for their own territorial holdings in the region, and thus they kind of wanted to still curtail Japanese expansion as much as possible. But knowing that they really didn't have the forces to send to East Asia in order to deal with the German colonies, and that robbing Germany of those colonies could help contribute further to the war effort back home, they did eventually oblige to Japan's request, and also requested that Japan would help them take care of the German navy in Chinese waters around the concession city of Tsingtao on the Shandong Peninsula. Japan would send Germany an ultimatum on August 15th of 1914 and would declare war on Germany when it refused to answer on August 23rd. So they sent an ultimatum to Germany basically stipulating their terms. Germany did not answer to those terms, and so Japan would officially declare war on the Germans on August 23rd of 1914. It would also declare war on Austro-Hungary on August 25th, just 2 days later, as Austro-Hungary had some naval forces out trying to help the Germans around the Chinese waters. Now, Japanese forces would quickly move to seize the main German territories in China, and the main territory that they went after was the German concession city of Tsingtao on the Shandong Peninsula. On September 2nd, forces would land on that peninsula in China and then would surround Qingdao and mount for what would become a long lasting siege. They would besiege the city from that date on September 2nd until it surrendered officially on November 7th, leading Japan to a very early victory against the Germans. It was even remarked by Kaiser Wilhelm II of the German Empire, who was the Emperor of Germany, that he would rather have surrendered one certain battle to the Russians. He would rather surrender Berlin to the Russians than he would rather surrender Qingdao to the Japanese, mostly showing his disdain for Asians and in general and his racist overtones for it. That he did not view that giving this concession up was really worth giving it up to who was taking it from him. And the Japanese very early on got a victory at Qingdao. They were able to get this large concession, but Qingdao would come back to kind of haunt them because it would become a point of contention in post war negotiations with the Chinese government. Now, during October of 1914, during the same time that the siege of Qingdao was going on, Japanese naval forces would also quickly move to seize the German colonies out in the Pacific. Mostly the islands of the Mariana, the Caroline, and Marshall Islands would all come under Japanese control with very little resistance mounted by the local colonial German troops. Alarmed by Japan's aggressive moves to both seize the Germany's Chinese concessions and to seize Germany's Pacific colonies, the British dominions of Australia and New Zealand were rightly concerned about Japanese expansion in their area of the world and very quickly sought to take some of the German colonies for themselves in order to prevent Japan from kind of ter- encroaching on their nations. So, very quickly, Australia and New Zealand would move to occupy some of the other German colonies before Japan could do so, most notably Kaiser Wilhelm's Land in what is now Papua New Guinea, and the islands of Samoa and Nauru. By late 1914, Japan was sending aid to Europe in the form of nurses and naval escorts in order to help the Allies seize control of basically helping the allies to maintain control of their naval trade routes and shipping lanes, while at the same time also sending medical staff to help with that. So most of the all the fighting in East Asia, at least, it pretty much ends by 1914. It's a very quick victory for Japan. Very little resistance they actually face from this. The following couple of years would see a little bit of difference and more Japan going into kind of the helping out role and sending forces far abroad. However, 1915 would also start what would very evidently, to anyone watching from a neutral standpoint, what would evidently mark where Japan was kind of actually in this war for. It wasn't in the war to help its allies. It was helping them, yes, but that wasn't why Japan was actually in this war. It saw an opportunity to expand, and it was going to take that opportunity as much as it possibly could. Japan would use the distraction of World War I in Europe in order to try to consolidate its position in China. It would present what it called the 21 demands to China in January of 1915. In these 21 demands, it would most notably reduce China to pretty much being a Japanese protectorate state. China would lose almost any visage of independent sovereignty that it had and would pretty much become a protectorate of the Japanese, much like had been done with Korea just a couple years before, and the Chinese rightly knew what had happened with Korea. Now, the 21, it would also reduce privileges that would be granted to the European powers. So basically, Japan wanted to turn China into a protectorate, while at the same time ousting the other European powers from the area in order to consolidate its power. Now, the 21 demands ultimately were scaled down due to slow negotiations with the Chinese government and anti Japanese sentiments and international condemnation, most notably from the neutral United States. It would end up being scaled back greatly before they were signed by China on May 25th of 1915. Now, over the next year, Germany would try unsuccessfully on its own to negotiate a separate peace treaty with Japan in order to get Japan out of the war. Japan would sign an agreement during that time with Russia in order to avoid making a separate peace, basically pledging along with Russia that they would make no separate peace with Germany without the consultation of the other Allied powers. Unfortunately, Russia itself would end up backing out of the war, and that would cause further issues. Now, Japan would continue its efforts to push the other powers from China during going into the later half of 1915 into 1916 and so on throughout the war, basically wanting to use the war as an excuse to try to consolidate their holdings over their Chinese territory and to gain even more influence within the Chinese government. In December of 1916, Britain would request naval aid from Japan, requesting that aid due to the highly unstable shipping lanes that were becoming attacked by and threatened by German and Austro-Hungarian U-boats in the Mediterranean Sea. Japan was willing to agree to sending naval aid if Britain backed its holdings of German territories post-war. So it comes with strings attached. Yes, sure, I will send you the naval support you need, but you need to be willing to back me on keeping these territories when the war is over and we're discussing who gets what. Now, Britain would end up agreeing. Again, they were hesitant to do so, but they did end up agreeing when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st of 1917, leading to a renewed U- unrestricted U-boat campaign against Allied shipping, and this caused Britain to need those Japanese naval escorts even much more than they had previously. So they very quickly were willing to agree to almost any condition that Japan set. The Japanese would send a new second special squadron of 17 ships to the Mediterranean in order to help out Allied operations there against German and Austro-Hungarian U submarines. Carried out They would end up carrying out escort duties and anti-submarine operations against the Germans and Austro-Hungarians in the Adriatic, Aegean, and Eastern Mediterranean seas. They would also help to secure the sea route from the Suez Canal in Egypt to Marseille in France, which would allow the Allies to have that critical artery trade link they needed between their holdings in India, most notably Britain's holdings in India, and the battlefields on the Western Front. Now, Japan's naval aid in the Mediterranean was largely a massive success. There was only about a total of 348 sorties that they ended up fighting in the Mediterranean. 789 ships ended up being escorted by the Japanese during their time in the Mediterranean, with over 700,000 troops being delivered due to their efforts. And during that time, only 72 Japanese sailors actually ended up getting killed, with 7,075 people even being rescued by the Japanese ships that had been sent to the Mediterranean to help out. The Japanese lost not one single ship during their time helping the Allies in the region, but they did get one. A destroyer was torpedoed by an Austro-Hungarian sub, but it did not sink. But it did manage to kill quite a few crew members. Now, with the US entering the war in April of 1917 and Russia pulling out, Japan would provide naval control patrols around Hawaii, around the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, in order to allow the United States to focus more of its naval resources toward the fight in the Atlantic in order to aid the British in fighting German submarines there. So in order to divert all those naval forces out there, they asked Japan, "Hey, we're officially allies now. Can you maybe take over naval patrol duty while I send a majority of my naval forces over to the Atlantic?" "Sure, buddy, we can do that." And that actually ended up working. Unfortunately, I mean, you could probably hypothesize that when the Japanese would launch the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, they probably had quite a few veterans in the Japanese Army and Navy who had probably seen Pearl Harbor, had studied it during World War One, and had thus had more than ample opportunity to figure out how an attack might be made. Now, Japan would also capture during the time that they had providing naval escorts in the Mediterranean, they would also end up capturing a total of 7 German submarines, which would help contribute to Japan's own submarine development in the years that followed. As we all know, by World War II, Japan, while not as prominent as the German U-boats, they did have quite the submarine fleet themselves, and this was mostly helped because prior to World War One, Japan really did not have submarines in its navy. That would change after the war, after they saw how effective they were in World War One, and now had 7 captured German ones of which to study and base their own designs off of, and make improvements based on their own technical expertise. Now, that was pretty much the gist of Japan's involvement with at least the Central Powers wise. However, it did have another big concluding thing to World War One that would also start to strain its relations with its allies and start to show more and more obviously that Japan was simply in this war for its own expansion. The October Revolution of 1917 saw the communist Bolsheviks seize power in revolutionary Russia. The Tsar had been overthrown in the February Revolution earlier that year. A provisional government had taken power in Petrograd earlier that year under the Alexander Kerensky, and thus this became a fractured government due to the division with the local Soviets that had been set up. And during the rest of the year, there was kind of this power struggle between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks, who kind of were rapidly gaining in political influence within the country. And by October, they staged a coup, ousting the provisional government. Kerensky fled Russia, and Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin are now in charge. They would later go on, of course, to founding the Soviet Union just a few years down the road. The overtake of provisional government in the October Revolution and the Bolsheviks coming to power, it absolutely terrified their fellow allies because up to this point, Russia had been one of the great allied powers. But the Bolsheviks have been preaching of getting Russia out of the war at any price. They did not care what price of peace was. They knew that the war was bad for Russia and thus we need to get out of it. The Allies are now terrified because with the Bolsheviks in power, Russia is likely to drop out of the conflict, allowing Germany and the other Central Powers to transfer hundreds of thousands of battle hardened troops from the Eastern Front with Russia to, to the West against Allied powers, which could possibly force a breakthrough. The Allies sought to keep Russia in the war during this. Now, they had been successful with that with the provisional government. They would not be successful with that with the Bolsheviks. So they saw the Bolsheviks as a threat. Now, the Bolsheviks um, brought them to power was not left unchallenged. There were plenty of Russians who were not big fans of communism and Marxism. They were not big fans of the Bolsheviks, and thus this initiated by early 1918 after the signing of the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, in which the Bolsheviks gave up a huge portion of the former Russian Empire. This absolutely enraged many Russians, which led to the outbreak of the Russian Civil War between the Bolsheviks in their Red Army and the white movement of Russians under mostly people that were both former czarist officials, people that were just anti-communist. It was a coalition of multiple forces that were united by their hatred of communism and Bolshevism. And this led to the Russian Civil War between the Red Army and the White Armies. Now, the Allies, of course, seeing an opportunity to oust the anti war Bolsheviks and hopefully get Russia back into the fight, began intervening in the Russian Civil War in 1918 on behalf of white forces. The United States and Japan would both send troops to Siberia in 1918 in order to occupy the region and help the white forces there. Japan would originally want to deploy over 70,000 troops to Siberia and advocated for even occupying the territory all the way inland to Lake Baikal, which was quite the distance. It would pretty much encompass all of Siberia being under Allied occupation. Japan viewed this because they had the idea that they could gain an advantage against Russia in the event that the Bolsheviks came out on top, while at the same time they could also create some kind of a Japanese controlled buffer state between them and Russia in the future. Of course, the United States kind of saw right through what this ruse was and very quickly came to oppose Japan's initial plan, which ended up being scaled back significantly. Now, as the war neared its end, Japan would supply multiple war material orders to its allies, which would create an economic boom that allowed Japan to become a first time creditor nation in which it was lending money and resources to other nations for the first time in its history. However, this sudden industrial boom and the capital influx that followed would end up causing a rapid rise in inflation, which would cause multiple problems down the road. And by 1926, Japan would be in full on recession, which would drastically help the Japanese militaristic military that had really gotten more aggressive in the decades since. And this gave them an excuse to expand the Japanese empire further. As a result, immediately of the rise in inflation, rice riots would break out in many Japanese cities over the rising inflation that was starting to occur. In 1919, Japan's delegation sat next to the big four of the main Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, at the Versailles Peace Conference. Now, World War I had officially ended that previous fall when Germany ended up signing the armistice on November 11th. However, the war was not officially concluded until a final peace treaty was made, and that was what the Versailles Peace Conference was for. Now, Japan was granted a permanent seat in the Versailles negotiations. It was granted a permanent seat on the Council of the League of Nations that would be formed by the Versailles Treaty. It would also be confirmed a transfer of German rights in Shandong province to Japan, much to the detriment of the Chinese, who had hoped that the territory, since the Germans had lost it, would be returned to China, and did not like at all that Japan was simply going to get the territory out of conquest when it had never really been German rule. It had never really been a German territory, it had just been German leased, and thus was still, in their view, Chinese territory. And Japan would also get to keep the German Pacific colonies that it took during the war for its own in the Pacific Mandate that they were granted. Now, the Japanese delegation would end up walking out of the Paris Peace Conference, mostly because of an issue that came about where the Japanese delegation had put forward the request for a racial equality clause to be included for the League of Nations. This was outright rejected by a majority of the other allied leaders, and this probably had something to do with the factor that they did not like the idea of an Asian power being able to think that it could deal just as rightly and be equal on the stage with European and Western powers, and this probably fueled their decision. However, many historians have kind of garnered the factor that this decision to exclude and ignore Japan's request for a racial equality clause was likely a contributing factor to the sense that the Japanese ended up getting after World War One, that their help during the war had not mattered, and that in many ways they were not respected by the wider global community, and that the only way they were going to get the respect they wanted was by fighting a war for it. And that would kind of would contribute again to the rise of Japanese militarism going forward. Now, this same rejection over the request for a racial equality clause would lead to the Japanese delegation officially walking out of peace talks. Japan would still get the terms that had already been negotiated, but its delegates would not be present for the rest of the remainder of the conference. China was, as we said, was greatly angered by Japan being allowed to keep Qingdao and pressured the Allies to hand it back. There were multiple protests and movements that began to erupt in China with the Chinese government's lucid acceptance of the Versailles Peace Conference and not challenging it. The Chinese populace grew into an absolute rage. And the May 4th movement would start later that year in 1919, which would, among other things, start the pure rise of the Chinese Communist Party, which is in power today over anger that the Allies were giving this rightfully Chinese territory to the Japanese, who had simply taken it from a power that had taken it from the Chinese. And this little pressure campaign to get Qingdao handed back, it would eventually work. In 1922, Qingdao would officially be returned, angering Japan even further. That same year, Japan was also forced to withdraw its remaining forces from Siberia and Vladivostok in Russia in order to get out of there. And of course, the Bolsheviks by this point had won the Civil War, and thus it was rapidly becoming the Soviet Union, and Japan was ordered to both withdraw from Qingdao, hand it back to the Chinese, and they were ordered to also withdraw from Siberia completely as a part of the League of Nations. This would anger Japan going forward because Japan felt that, these conquests were something that it wanted. It had rightfully taken Qingdao. It thought that it should have been its own to govern and take for its own. It did not think that the Chinese had any right to it. They also did not think that the Russians should have been allowed to take Siberia back because they wanted to create some kind of a buffer zone. By no means were either moves good. They were, by all means, that a move of an aggressive expansionist power, but it angered Japan to the point that they started to view the West as antagonistic and not so much as an ally. And just to show here a couple images that we do have relating to this. So here are a picture of some German troops in Qingdao during the siege against the Japanese. This was their main Chinese concession city that they had had prior to World War One, and by November of 1914, they ended up surrendering it to the Japanese. Here we have some Japanese soldiers actually looking out and occupying a former German defensive trench that they had seized around Qingdao during the siege. Here are some Japanese troops actually coming ashore near Qingdao during the beginning of the arrival of the Japanese forces on the Shandong Peninsula. This would have been September of 1914. Here we have a Japanese propaganda lithograph of them occupying one of the Russian cities in Siberia during the Allied intervention during the Russian Civil War, of course, which they would later be forced to give back. And then here, finally, we have a map of what Japan kind of gets from here. I'm going to mark them with a pen here as we go through here just to make it a little easier to see because they're not particularly well marked other than who owned what beforehand. Well, if I can find a pen that works, would be a good thing here. So here is going to be the main areas that Japan is going to get. So this is kind of from more of a before the war, but this big section here used to be German colonial territory, and this little strip of Papua New Guinea used to be German territory. Japan is going to get up here the Mariana Islands. They're also going to get Palau. They would also get the Carolines and the Marshalls. All that would become a Japanese mandate that they're going to get on top of all this up here that they already got, including Korea and the southern half of Sakhalin from the Russo-Japanese War. So Japan has rapidly carved out a good empire for itself in less than about 20 years. At the end of World War One, Japan is officially seen as an official great power. And not to mention, they also have, I forgot to mention down here, they also have control of Taiwan from the First Sino-Japanese War from 1895. But Japan's experience during World War One, while it would allow it to expand its empire even further, it would also create the conditions going into the future for which it would feel that it was going to go out on its own and have to come into conflict with the great powers of the West in order to expand the empire even further. For most notably, one of the key ways of which they kind of got detrimented was in 1922, you had the Washington Naval Treaty that ended up getting signed, and which the great powers of Great Britain, the United States, and Japan all kind of agreed to limit their navies. However, Japan had a much less smaller navy than either the United States or Great Britain had at the time, and thus their reduction in order to meet that treaty's demands left them with an even weaker navy than the other two. And the navy was, of course, a pride of the Japanese people. It was an island nation just like Great Britain, and thus they had a lot of pride in their navy. But it also was seen by the Japanese government as a way to try to weaken Japan's, armed forces in the event of conflict in the future, and this also was not received very well at all. So, going into the 1920s, going into the 1930s, there starts to become the idea in Japanese society that the West is antagonistic to Japan's future expansion, and that if we're going to expand further, we will inevitably have to come into conflict with the Western powers, including Great Britain and the United States, which will start moving toward World War II. But we will discuss more of that in depth with the last video in this little look at it with Japanese militarism and how that comes about. So, as I said, not the longest video for today. We're more just going over some of the basic things that Japan had done during the First World War, of which it was an ally the first time around, but then come a few years down the road, it would not be. And World War One, in many ways, sets Japan up for territory wise what it's going to have to springboard from when it goes in for its war in 1940, in 1939, 1941, depending on what country you want to say World War One started with. With the United States, for us, it started in 1941 because we were not attacked until that year. For Great Britain or France or many of the nations of Europe, it started in 1939. And then even if you're in China, goodness sakes, it started way earlier than that, like early 1930s, like 1931, I believe, when Japan officially invaded Manchuria and started to invade China in a second war against China. That was nothing but aggression. So that concludes for the video for today. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, any added information, or anything of that manner, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to look through it when I get the chance. As for our next video, I think we might be taking a look at the Chinese Revolution that occurred back in 1911 that ended up ending the Qing Dynasty. I think that might be where we're going to head next. I'm not completely certain yet, but I'm kind of pointing. I do want to cover that at some point. I just don't know if it'll be the next video or not. So that's just an idea of where we're going, or if anyone has any suggestions for videos, feel free to pop them in as well, and we can definitely fit one of them in if it's something that I think is worth taking a look at. So that will conclude for today. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when it comes out.